One country uses its support for terrorist proxies to conduct its foreign policy and to compensate for its own weakness. That country is Iran. Iran was first designated by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism in 1984. Its training, funding, and arming of terrorists has continued unabated to this day. Terrorist proxies are doing the Iranian regime's will in Iraq and in Syria. Iran also supports Hamas and Bahraini terrorist groups. Through its partner Hezbollah, Iran is engaged in preparing for war in Lebanon. It is building an arsenal of weapons and battle-hardened troops.
U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, calling out Iran again at the UN Security Council, saying Iran stands out as a country that is training, funding, and arming terrorists to this day. This on the heel of a new resolution passed unanimously today aimed at stopping terrorists from acquiring arms. Let's look at defense contractors Boeing continuing to tick lower, ending the day in the red. Lockheed Martin closing higher. Let's bring in former U.S. Ambassador to the UN. He is a Fox News contributor. He's John Bolton. Good to see you, John.
Glad to be with you.
Will sanctions be enough to stop Iran from sponsoring terrorism and ICBM production?
Well, these sanctions will not do it. Like many sanctions from the Obama era, the sanctions in the congressional legislation, and it applies to those dealing with Russia and North Korea as well, are of the kind of targeted sanctions that are intended to be aimed at individuals or companies or government entities that in this case support terrorism or other conduct that we're trying to go after. The trouble is when you target sanctions, you allow people to get around them. If you target the ABC Corporation, you'll find the next day that there's a cutout called the XYZ Corporation doing the same thing. So I think to be effective, sanctions need to be much more sweeping. This is a step in the right direction. It certainly sends a political signal. I don't think, unfortunately, it will affect Iran's behavior on terrorism, really, or anything else.
You know, Ambassador, Iran claims it's the U.S. that's violated the 2015 nuclear deal by passing these new sanctions. President Trump has threatened in the past to basically pull out of that deal. Should he? Is Iran violating the deal?
Well, he should pull out of the deal because the deal is not in America's best interest. It was a diplomatic Waterloo for the United States. And the real question any president has to ask is this deal in our strategic interest? This deal wasn't in 2015 when it was agreed. It's just gotten worse over time. And yes, Iran is violating the deal in multiple respects. The trouble is the deal is so badly written that people are having arcane arguments about whether there's a violation, but is it a material violation? Look, you have to look at the total picture not just in connection with the nuclear deal or the ballistic missile program, which are two sides of the same coin, really, but also on Iran's overall conduct. Fundamentally, an Iranian nuclear weapons capability is another terrorist weapon. It's not a military threat to the United States. It's a threat to innocent American civilians. So if from that perspective, I think Iranian policy is actually fairly seamless and logical from their perspective. We're the ones who don't seem to get the picture.
Let's switch to MS-13. Fox News' Tucker Carlson. He got an exclusive look into one of the world's most deadliest violent gangs, speaking with a member of the gang, MS-13, in El Salvador, learning how MS-13 has become such a threat to the United States. MS-13 is responsible for about 2/3 of the homicides in El Salvador.
How hard is it for an MS-13 gang member to get into the United States?
It's easy.
How do you do it?
I never wanted to go to the United States.
But your friends who did, how did they get in?
They have their passes, they have their people.
First, let's check into private prison stocks ending the day in the red. We're looking at Core Civic and GEO Group closing down over 3%. Did you hear that, Ambassador? The gang member said it's easy to get into the U.S. This is a gang member of MS-13.
Right, and I think that's something that we don't emphasize enough about the porous southern border. It's not simply an immigration question, an illegal immigration question. It's a question of drug trafficking coming all throughout the Western Hemisphere through Mexico. It's caused instability in Mexican government and civil society. It's just like a pipeline with the violence associated with drug production coming directly into the United States, and the possibility that terrorists, including nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons terrorists, could use the same mechanisms as the traffickers to bring their weapons into the United States, too. So there's a real, to my mind, a real law enforcement and national security issue here, quite apart from the immigration debate.
It's an important point you just raised. And MS-13, law enforcement officials have told us at Fox Business that this is a gang that is known to machete and hack people to death. How can the U.S. stop the growth of this violent gang? They're in 40 states. There's something like 10,000 of them.
Well, I think it's part and parcel of the distribution of illegal drugs, and I think that's why, although there's a lot of talk really on both sides of the aisle now about more drug legalization, I think it's a huge mistake. I think if you actually enforce the laws, as we're seeing in the case of immigration, the danger of abuse drops. And I think this would be something, frankly, that in Mexico and throughout Central America in particular, but down into Colombia and Venezuela, if we actually enforced our laws and dried up demand in the United States, we'd be bringing peace and stability, or at least increasing the chances of it in those countries and reducing the incentive for many of their innocent civilians to want to come to this country.
That's a very, very good point. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for coming on the show. We love having you on.